What's on your radar, Robby?
Well, remember Kiwi Farms? We talked about it on the show last week. Contrary to what you might expect if you missed that segment, Kiwi Farms is not, well, a place where kiwis are grown on bushes, on trees. I don't actually know how kiwis are grown, but that's not what we're talking about, so it doesn't matter. It's an online forum with some particularly nasty users who sometimes engage in harassment of their enemies, which in some cases are progressive online personalities. Rather, I should say it was an online forum. Kiwi Farms was essentially shut down last week after Cloudflare, which is a tech security company whose services allowed it to exist, they dropped Kiwi Farms in response to public pressure. It's all a bit complicated, but essentially Cloudflare bowed to the demands of Clara Sorrenti, who's a transgender activist better known as Keffals. Keffals was subjected to very nasty, very harsh criticism and harassment from Kiwi Farms users. She also said they stalked her and doxed her, obsessing over her physical location, calling in fake police reports against her, forcing her to move, just in general making her life miserable. Now, Cloudflare CEO Matthew Prince, who's a self-described free speech absolutist, initially refused to punish Kiwi Farms, but eventually gave in and reversed himself. So the reason he gave was that there was so much content on Kiwi Farms that wasn't just toxic, but actively dangerous. It presented a real conundrum for the police to actually keep it running. Quote, "We believe there is an unprecedented emergency and immediate threat to human life, unlike we have previously seen from Kiwi Farms or any other customer before," said Prince. So that was the end of Kiwi Farms. Now, the Internet Archives, also known as the Wayback Machine, deleted Kiwi Farms, which is a pretty strident example of erasing Internet history, which is generally something the Wayback Machine does not do unless there's a copyright infringement involved or you specifically request them to do it. In some cases, they will. Anyway, this is the backstory. Okay, so you might be wondering, why should I care? Well, that's because Keffals' claims are not as persuasive as many people thought. There's a good argument to be made that the mainstream media, which echoed Keffals' claims and demanded action, they got this wrong. As is so often the case, those clamoring for censorship are being a little bit careless in their zeal to crack down on problematic speech and expression. Now, the independent journalist Jesse Singal recently dug into some of Keffals' claims, found that while there were indeed, to be clear, tons of comments about her on Kiwi Farms, much of it toxic, nasty, and, in his words, undoubtedly transphobic, there weren't a lot of actual threats against her, violent threats. Yes, she had been doxxed, and yes, some Kiwi Farms users seemed obsessed with pinpointing her location, but she was constantly posting screenshots of their comments, very much a toxic, egging on kind of phenomenon. So again, to be clear, I think much of what was said in this forum was pretty awful, but the internet can be an awful place. Twitter is frequently an awful place, but no one is rushing to remove it from the internet. It's because it has more mainstream protection and legitimacy. So my colleague at Reason Magazine, Elizabeth Nolan Brown, makes a similarly important point. Just because you take down one place where hateful people congregate does not mean you eliminate said hate. You might just drive them somewhere else. She writes, "The problem isn't the expression of extremist views, it's the extremist views. Cutting out one digital avenue for offensive speech or organized harassment does nothing about the underlying sentiments and may only harden people in their extremist viewpoints. Feeling marginalized and attacked is powerful at building community and solidarity." See, for example, former President Donald Trump. And because this is such an important and nuanced topic relating to internet, censorship, and so on, I invited Elizabeth Nolan Brown to join us for this discussion. Liz, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So this is a pretty complicated internet controversy story, like insanely complicated. Bree was saying she tried to listen to Jesse Singal's podcast episode about it. I think we all struggled to get through the entire thing because it's such a confusing subject. But because it does, kind of involve these important internet censorship, discussion, or light censorship, because again, these are private actors kind of doing what they think is best, but they're responding to various pressure campaigns from all sorts of people. So, what was your takeaway after kind of the newer information came out? And following what Jesse said, looking more closely, it seemed like yes, there was a lot of bad stuff, but then it was less persuasive. That it was just there was so much violent threats being made that the site couldn't deal with, and like that was the reason it got shut down. What's your reading?
Yeah, I mean, even if there was some small number of violent threats, which I think that, as Jesse pointed out, it was not a large number. Maybe that they weren't just concerned with the violent threats, they were concerned with people posting her location, which even if then that wasn't a direct threat, was sort of an implied threat perhaps. But I think the big question is, will taking down Kiwi Farms actually help? There's already some evidence that a lot of people who were on Kiwi Farms have moved on to encrypted messaging on, say, Telegram. The people who came to Kiwi Farms often came from 8chan once that was shut down. So we keep moving to different sites, but these sort of sentiments and these sort of harassment campaigns still exist. And if they're moving to encrypted apps, that's arguably worse, because now no one can see them, and law enforcement can't see if they're real or not. Nobody can judge for themselves whether or not they're real. I think just putting this in less plain view does not make the situation better.
Yeah, there's actually a terrorism parallel here, because you've probably seen this study too, right? That actually driving like ISIS content off of more mainstream social media sites, Facebook, etc., right, causes them to go to Telegram or more encrypted, more difficult to trace messaging systems. That's actually, from a law enforcement perspective, very bad.
Yeah. The same thing with when they shut down Backpage, which sex workers advertised on, but also small percentage of bad people, and people think, well, they're advertising there, we need to shut it down, but they were also helping the cops find the bad people. So I think you have that same sort of situation here.
Yeah, that's a great example. You've done a lot of good reporting on Backpage, which the federal government really harassed the people who had founded it, who cooperated with law enforcement when there was actually criminal bad stuff going on. And it's like you don't necessarily eliminate the underlying criminal behavior. You just make it harder to trace and to identify.
Right. And then if we're just talking about the offensive speech, like you said, there's offensive speech on all sorts of websites. And typically, companies like Cloudflare that run the back-end part of internet, Cloudflare even said in a blog post, they're like, we think of ourselves more like the phone company. If someone says racist or sexist or otherwise offensive things on the telephone, we don't cancel their phone service. So that's typically how Cloudflare thought of themselves. Now, with this decision and with a few other decisions they've made, like with 8chan, they're sort of reversing course on that, and I think that could set a really dangerous precedent.
I wonder, Elizabeth, what you think the line is between some of these private companies perhaps deciding that not the offensive speech, because as you both have pointed out, there's offensive speech everywhere, but the specific kind of doxing, the tracking. This was the woman who fled to, what was it, Ireland or something like that, and they followed her there, identified several places where she was, swatted her. At what point do you think it is potentially reasonable for some of these companies to say, I'm getting too exposed here in terms of my legal liability for facilitating folks being able to engage in this potentially dangerous behavior on my website, and so I'm going to make the choice to, quell these communities? Yeah,
I think that's a great point, because Cloudflare was probably acting very rationally when it comes to what you mentioned with the legal liability. I just think that the law enforcement should be handling the people that are making the direct threats or doing this harassment campaigns, rather than trying to hold these third parties like the people that do back end services for these websites accountable.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.